dreary night, I think. I have not been outside since 10 a.m. though. I think we're in for a treat. This is the first creative response for our Caitlin Teal Price exhibition. For those of you who don't know, this is a program that we started here at Grace going on a year and a half now, almost 2 years, where with each exhibition we invite an expert, a specialist in their field to come and respond to the work on view. So we've had dancers, choreographers, we've had visual artists, we've had musicians, we've had philosophers. Tonight we have a historian. And they're really meaningful programs. One of the goals is to create new content and new context for the artwork that we have on view. So the format is that our guest, MJ, who Sarah will introduce, will speak for 10-15 minutes, share thoughts on the exhibition, and then open it up for conversation with the group. So be prepared to participate, think of good questions, comments, and we'll have a good time tonight. Our next program is a workshop with Caitlin.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
On the 20th, a Saturday, and I think it'll be photograms, open to all ages, participatory. You can make work inspired by the exhibition. There will be one more creative response, a conversation between myself and Caitlin, who is here, and a talk by Dorothy Moss, curator at the National Portrait Gallery, who has written about Caitlin's past work. So it'll be nice to get an updated perspective on this new work. And I know Robert Gowdy, our board chair, is on his way, but he would be very angry at me if I did not mention the great talk we had this past weekend at the National Gallery of Art. Really a pleasure and an honor to be on the stage of the National Gallery with Caitlin and John Pilson, another artist who is based up in New York and chairs the photography department at Yale. If you did miss the talk, it will eventually be available online. We will let you know when that happens. So without further ado, thank you, Caitlin. Thank you to my team. Thank you, MJ. Thank you to my board, Reston Community Center, who supports these programs. And let's have a nice discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Lily. So I am.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. We can fix it.
Buddy. No, it's me. I forgot that I had a thing in my lap.
It's okay. He works in the tech field.
Oh, cool.
So.
I only had like 3 slides. Some words.
So we're starting off with a bang. I'm introducing MJ Rymsza-Pawlowska. So Lily and I were discussing who we should bring in for these responses. It's always a big conversation that we have for every show. And she told me about this historian that she knows who happens to also be researching time capsules right now. And we thought, that's it, that's perfect. So MJ is an assistant professor of history at American University. She's also the associate director of the graduate program in public history. Her first book, History Comes Alive, Public History and Popular Culture in the 1970s, was published last year, and she's working on a new book about time capsules and artist time capsules. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So everybody, please help me welcome MJ.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Lily. It's really fun to be here. So I know this intro sounded like it said history a bunch of times, which is true. And I have a slide up here that says history, so everything's really clear. But actually, before I was a historian, I worked in contemporary art galleries for a few years, and I was telling Lily that I'm very pleased to be sort of back in this kind of space and getting to engage with art in the way that I used to. So I'm very, very excited. So I guess like Like Caitlin Till Price, I'm lucky that different parts of my intellectual practice and my lived experience sort of intersect in interesting and often serendipitous ways. So I find myself adapting things I encounter into things that I teach and write about, and vice versa. So there's some sort of sense that everything's kind of a big loop. So as Sarah mentioned, I teach public history, not yet. Oh. So as Sarah mentioned, I teach public history. We have a graduate program. Essentially that means that we are preparing graduate students to work with the public to share history in a variety of ways, whether that means sort of publicly engaged, working with the public to take their own histories, or sort of working in museums and doing historic interpretations. So a lot of the classes that I teach sort of tend to be around this topic. So this week, I'm teaching a class right now for our first year. It's called the Public History Seminar, and we are reading a book called Nearby History, and that's the book that we're reading. In case you're interested, it's a pretty good book. It's really basic. It's actually just a how-to of how to do history. To find documents, to interpret photographs, to analyze diaries. First it was published in 1983, but people still sort of read and use it widely today. And it still really doesn't show its age. There's kind of a cute part at the very end about how to use the internet, but otherwise it's a great book. One of the reasons that I really like it is at the very beginning, the authors are trying to explain why they're calling the book Nearby History and what nearby history is, and I think it's actually quite beautiful. So this type of history is often called other things. It's called local history, or community history, or family history, or even social history. And what they say is they're like, well, this is okay, but those are all very narrow terms because they center on physical place or on sort of biological relationships, right? Whereas to them, nearby communicates something about a proximity that is both physical and emotional. So that's one of the reasons that I really like that book. So in other words, we're nearby to a lot of people and places and things and ideas. And what the kind of gambit of this book is that there's a lot of different ways to do histories of these. And in fact, really wonderful, robust, interdisciplinary ways to do this kind of history. So this is what I mean by the kind of serendipity. Just this week I was talking about nearby history with my students, and I walked into this gallery and I was like, oh, well, this show is Caitlin's Nearby History. It's a documentation of the people and places and processes that are proximate to her, both sort of physically proximate and emotionally proximate too, so we can talk more about what that might mean. So most of Nearby History, the book, is a primer on how to read and make sense of historical sources, whether they are published or unpublished texts, maps, material, culture, or images. Images, the authors point out, are especially tricky because we think of them as documentary, that is a sort of very direct representation of things as they actually were. And so we often, when we encounter pictures in the world around us, we fail to take the initiative to read them more critically, right? We're prone to taking them literally. Of course, art is all about not taking images literally, so perhaps we're in the right space to sort of try to disabuse ourselves of that practice, and disabuse ourselves of that practice in every day, right? And we can borrow a page. So, and actually, the kind of questions that the authors of Nearby History sort of counsel that we asked about the images that we see are questions that are well worth asking, not only in historical practice, which is what they're trying to do, but in the gallery world. They might actually even come from art. So under what circumstances was this made? What do we know about the person who made it? What do we know about its purpose? What was it meant to do? And how do we feel when we see it? And maybe it's this last one that's the most important. Nearby History's authors point out that many images have hidden meanings, hidden circumstances of production, and hidden context, right? This is maybe one of the things that makes them tricky. I think this is certainly true of these pieces. On the surface, they're beautifully composed, somewhat abstracted images of everyday objects, but they're also so highly personal. They're things from the artist's everyday life, her nearby history, and to her, they're a means of connecting to sort of universal feelings. So this is, of course, the power of images, right? And this is why the authors of Nearby History advise us to both sort of pay extra attention to them, but also to be cautious. But that's history, and this is art, and history and even nearby history is sort of weighed in different ways, right? So this is one of the things that I was thinking about when I was coming over here is I was like, well, what's the difference between art practice and history practice, right? We still have, on the history side of things, an investment in empiricism. So this is why we sometimes classify ourselves as a social science. We look for evidence, we argue from evidence, there's lots of footnotes, there's a burden of proof. So evidence is central to the conclusions that we can and do make, and so the way that meaning is made in history is sometimes sort of limited. The full range of emotions, for example, isn't represented in the same way. And that's, I think, why a lot of the best art, the best history is in fact in art. So one of the pieces that I was thinking about, let's see if I can use this thing, when I saw this was Fred Wilson's very famous installation, Minding the Museum. Is anyone familiar with this, the Maryland Historical Society? So we can talk about this a little bit more again in our conversation. But essentially, Fred Wilson is an artist who, one of the things that he does is institutional critique. So he's sort of interested in how art and galleries make meaning. He was invited by the Maryland Historical Society in 1992 to come and basically do something with their collection. So take all the things that they have and juxtapose it in different ways. So Fred Wilson immediately went and saw and said, well, there's a lot of sort of the type of things that are kept by the Maryland Historical Society are the things that are left over and were owned by people in power, right? Where are the other stories? And one of the ways that he kind of wanted to change that is through juxtaposition, right? So for the two slides that I have here, one is you can see sort of slave shackles that are in the midst of a silver tea service. And the other is sort of clan hood in a baby carriage. So again, when you see this, you have emotions. You might not know right away what to do with them, but in some ways the kind of history that it's doing and the kind of questions that it's asking about how we make meaning from things and how we understand our past are much more potent. So I see a bit of that work here, the unexpected juxtaposition of objects, I think, the way that meaning is made on the level of sort of emotional response. On the other hand, too, and this is the other one I thought of, there's a little bit of the Joseph Cornell box here, too, the collecting, the assemblage, the sort of practice of the magpie. These pieces here, and I guess like Cornell's as well, are documenting a collecting practice. And actually during the conversation, it might be fun to talk about how sort of inherently weird collecting is in general. The impulse to sort of gather things and then classify them according to a category, and then put them on display, which is the weirdest thing still. I mean, the collection and the display too is, by the way, where the alchemy happens. So where the green helps make the gold, as the artist's son says, where the trash becomes the treasure, right? Not that these were ever trash, this part they were, and they were art. These maybe more so, because they're actually boxes. So at the end of nearby history, maybe I can go back to that slide. So this is before the part about the internet, the end that was written in 1983. After they've spent about 200 pages telling you how to do all of this stuff, to read objects around you critically, the authors only then make the case for the practice. So why is it that we should be doing nearby history to begin with? And what they say is that by doing nearby history, it's important because you're not only uncovering the history that's nearby you, you're uncovering that every history that's nearby you is also sort of by definition nearby someone else, right? And so the value of this is recognizing the importance of the immediate and the importance of proximity to forming these larger relationships, right? When you take a bunch of nearby histories and put them together, you have histories that are universal in a particular way. I think that this is a lesson that's also learned from this show. So it's Caitlin Teal Price's Nearby History, but it might be yours and it might be mine as well. Thank you. I apologize, that's very lectury. That's my creative response. Or that's the genre that I work in. But I'm very happy to sort of have a conversation about whatever.
So, art and artifact, and the difference between the two. I mean, in the slide that you showed us, context is everything, so I suppose the answer is simply how one contextualizes the artifact, but maybe there's more to it than that. Do you want to comment on that as an historian?
interesting question. I mean, yeah, as a historian, my impulse is, of course, context is everything, right? And things are art and things are artifact at different times. Actually, I'll talk about this really. So the work that I'm doing is, right now, is I'm doing the history of the 20th century time capsule. And one of the time capsules that, or the types of time capsules that I'm looking at is this thing that Andy Warhol did. So Andy Warhol, when he moved studios in 1974, just started putting things in boxes. In the end, he made 612 boxes, and they're all at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the boxes sort of run the gamut of all kinds of things. Sometimes it's just like magazines or trash or clothing, sometimes priceless things. He was quite a collector, so things that he collected, but sometimes his own art or things that retroactively, as we sort of move the work of Andy Warhol through all these different stages, have now become art because they've been shown in galleries. So for example, the kind of film strip photographs that he uses as bases for portraits are now, I think, more considered art than they were at the time. And so as I was doing this work, they've only opened 100 of these, even though they've been opening them since 1986. They have like 500 left. And the reason is because they're having a terrible time cataloging them. And it's precisely because they don't know how to treat them as art or artifact. And they've sort of gone around, they've asked all these people that were associates of Andy Warhol what they were, and one guy was like, well, I think he thought they were sculpture, and then someone else is like, oh, he was just a hoarder, and that was his thing. You know, so they can't get a beat on it at all. So yeah, this is all to say, this is, I guess, to make an extended argument for context and relativism, that artifact and art, I mean, some stuff starts as an art. When it's shown in a history museum, it's an artifact, or when it's found by someone, it's an artifact. Sometimes something starts as a toilet and then becomes a piece of art.
Huh. Maybe he intended exactly what's happening, which is you're totally confused, and that's exactly what is making him smile.
That's what I think too. I mean, this is really a person that knew how to deal with the excesses, and playfully with the excesses of popular culture. Yeah.
And maybe that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, no, I feel bad for those museum people. They're having a terrible time. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? I mean, this is a really interesting question. How would you draw the line between art and artifacts?
It's a question that is relevant to so many different things. And thinking, you know, now one of the big topics in collecting in museum collections is performance art. And what counts as the art, what is just an artifact of a performance. And I think one of the questions that's interesting to me, and as we're talking about with Warhol, is who gets to make that definition. So you have artists who aren't there to say, yes, you can use this photograph as artwork now, even though it just represents my performance that I thought was the artwork. And so I think it's actually asking a lot more of the producer. Like if Warhol was around now, people wouldn't let him get away with just saying, I don't know, you figure it out. He would have to define it. But then an historian or a curator might disagree and not let him get off that easy. But it's shifting definitions and depending on who gets to be the authority.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true on the other side of things, on the history side of things. I think we often, and I kind of talked about this a little bit in a sideways way in my talk, we often assume the things that the authors of nearby history tell us not to assume. So when I read a history book, often it'll like, you know, be like something, something, this person, this place, something else, and then there'll be like a photograph of this person in this place. And the photograph might be totally bizarre and deserve like a critical reading, but it's not necessarily in our toolbox as historians to do it in that way. Historians, because they're really empirical, really like textual documents, they sometimes don't know what to do with visual documents. They think that visual documents speak for themselves, or, you know, maybe it's because of the connection that historians have with museums and material culture too, because we sort of have that same thing about stuff as well. I don't know. You look like you have a question or a comment or observation.
I'm just trying to form my thoughts, but isn't art in the eye of the beholder So why do you have to differentiate between art and artifact? Artifact can be art if that's how you want to see it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I guess money. Depending on what kind of an art or an artifact it is, it might sort of it might have different values assigned to it.
Yeah, but if you're talking about, for example, the photograph of performance art, well, photography is art.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that's an artifact of a performance, but how is it done? How artfully is it done? So would it be considered art?
I mean, that's a really good question. What is owning the photograph of the performance? Sort of like, what's the meaning behind that? What are you communicating to an audience, a member or a visitor to your home or wherever you have it by having it? Is it that you're like cool enough to understand this performance, that you're making a sly wink at medium? Maybe it is a really beautiful photograph. Maybe it's a really beautiful performance.
Or context then, what if that same photograph is on somebody's wall or reproduced in a newspaper, but it's the exact same image?
And then is the artist the performer or the photographer who took the photo?
That makes me think of the sort of the controversy over those of the Obama posters. That they were, so it's originally like an AP photograph that an AP photographer took of Barack Obama, and then the artist, the graffiti artist Shepard Fairey, turned it into a poster that said Hope, and then it was sold as a campaign artifact, and then I think the AP artist sued Shepard Fairey, and then Shepard Fairey sued him right back. Or something very complicated happened. But the question at the core of this is, you know, what is this thing? Is it a documentary, a photograph? Is it, you know, political ephemera? Is it art?
And the courtroom drama was performance.
Right, so it's a little bit of everything.
Well, I think this also goes back to the idea of the alchemy too in the exhibition, and what makes, you know, trash a treasure, and who gets to define the value, and who is the alchemist, and where does that happen? Yeah, I know at our talk over the weekend, Robert had said that there was really a poignant moment when it clicked that Caitlin was collecting these objects off of the street from her kids who, you know, we as adults would maybe see trash, but these kids were seeing treasure and were giving it to their mom for safekeeping, and that this work honors that.
So Caitlin, what did you do with all these objects after you took the
I
pictures?
still have
of
them. Are you kidding me? And I keep getting more. I think I have some in my purse right now. I love them. I love them. And I don't know what's going to happen with them, but I cherish them all.
Now, there's so many things in my garage and in drawers that I cherish, and he considers them trash. So we have this constant battle about
Yeah.
what to do with them. And what's funny is when I finally decide to part with something, I don't think I even remember it the next day.
Well, so that's funny. I was just thinking, like, if I lost something, I probably wouldn't notice. I think it's like the collective whole that I really like. It's not like one piece or the other. But I just like the idea, and I like the sorting of it, and I like that it keeps getting bigger and then falling, you know, away. And yeah.
For anybody who's ever lost someone that you have to then clean out their belongings, and you see what they've been holding on to, you wonder, going on here, because I don't know what the specialness of it was. And it might have been very special. And I don't like the idea of throwing those things away, but we have to make decisions, and that's hard. Who's making that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I've had to do that for my great aunt. It was a really gut-wrenching, and we couldn't throw it. She lived in Poland, so we actually had to get rid of everything. And we ended up sort of bagging it up really quickly. And this is this person's entire life,
Yeah.
but that just changed, you know, the reverse alchemy, I guess. I wanted to ask, and I asked Lily, what like part of DC were these collected in?
Mostly west, northeast. Yeah.
Because I mean, the thing that struck me is, I thought they were all really industrial.
Yeah.
And I was like, and Lily was like, oh, I think somewhere in Northwest, maybe even like Cleveland Park. And I was like, but I live in Cleveland Park. And there's, I've never seen this kind of stuff on the street before in my life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they come from all different places. I mean, both Northwest and Northeast and yeah. But the boys, they like certain things. They have an aesthetic.
They do. I was gonna say something.
Yeah.
They're
So-
shiny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Pointy.
Yeah,
Sharp.
Totally Freudian.
But this is also, this is also my edit of their collection.
Yeah.
Like I choose the things that interest me from it. This is a very small portion of what has been collected. So it's like a little bit of both. Like the pointiness, I feel like is kind of, while them is also very much me. So.
Do you think that they're sort of collecting sensibilities and maybe you're collecting sensibility? To what degree is it a social practice?
Well, it's turned into that. At first it was all them. But it's become sort of a joint effort. And they're like, now when they collect things, they're like, look, Mom, look. It's like, it's become more, and I collect stuff now. Like I picked up something today off the ground and everybody laughed at me.
And it has
Like,
a
I
much
can't
more
help
public.
it. I know, they're like, But, yeah.
You don't know how to collect, Mom, you just know how to create.
Yeah.
Collect.
I'll talk about it, yeah.
There's something that, I've forgotten the species, but in the type of bird, the male lines its nest by getting shiny objects in various
Bowerbirds.
ways. I'm sorry?
Bowerbirds.
Bowerbird, okay. And it creates a bower and it decorates it with found objects
Yeah,
in order to attract a female.
yeah,
And there's a certain parallel going on.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You know about those birds, yeah.
Cool.
MJ, you had mentioned this idea of collecting too, and what a strange idea it is. Do you have a theory on why people collect? I mean, you go back to the cabinets of curiosity, but that people were collecting before they were putting their collections on display.
Yeah, I mean, that's the, nobody knows. It's a very anthropological question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like now a lot of collecting has to do with sort of, like consumer culture and, I don't know, wanting to fill like lives with things. But yeah, I mean, the cabinets of curiosity, sometimes they were totally secret, sometimes they were to sort of show certain intimates, all these kind of things that you had, the sort of ability to put things together. So a lot of the museum itself comes out of the Enlightenment, and so the sort of what we consider the modern museum is all about this. It's it's the exact same time that they were writing a dictionary for the first time and an encyclopedia. It was this sort of movement towards taxonomy and towards classifying things by connecting them with other things too. And there's something that here too. So I wonder. I mean, there's this sort of the series, right? That all of these make sense because you see them as parts of other things, and that changes the way that we interact with them. But no, I don't know why people collect. Probably for all kinds of social reasons.
Yeah.
I know people who collect guitars, and they collect them because you can play them, you can make music with them. But also the provenance of the guitar changes its value. And if this is the guitar Jimi Hendrix was playing at Woodstock, and you can see it on the movie, the price goes way up. And how value is determined is, sometimes it doesn't make much sense because some of these guitars aren't playable anymore, but they're a lot.
I mean, alchemy is a really good metaphor for that maybe there's lots of different things that can sort of act in an alchemic way, whether that's the fact that a certain person played a guitar, or that your sons found this like little piece of metal, or Duchamp signed a urinal, or my aunt had any of these things. The time capsules are kind of like that too. The time capsules. One thing that I'm finding is like there isn't yet a history of anyone digging up a time capsule and being at all interested in what it's inside. Either it's totally, has decimated itself into dust, or it's just banal by our standards. So we're like, okay, a newspaper and, you know, coin and a list of people that were in this club, and that's it. So there's lots of different ways that things become one thing and into another thing, and so maybe that's something we could talk about too.
Are you researching the history of time capsules, or are you interested in making a time capsule?
I probably eventually both. All right, I'm researching. I'm interested. So if you think about it, the history of so the first thing that was called a time capsule was made as part of the 1939 World's Fair, and it was made by Westinghouse, and it was supposed to last 5,000 years. So 1939, World's Fairs in general, this is a moment where like people are thinking about the future in a particular way for the first time. Things are speeding up. All of a sudden, it might seem more important to kind of document yourself because things are going to change really quickly. So there's a way in which the history of time capsules sort of lines up perfectly with the history of the future, which is something that I'm interested in. But if you were to sort of go back farther to things that could be time capsules, cornerstones, the first sort of activity, time capsule-like activity, was actually buried by Sam Adams in Boston in 1773. They dug it up in 2015, and it was like a pile of paper and some coins, and it was only, I guess the alchemy there is that it had been buried by Sam Adams. So people were doing cornerstones before that. In the late 1800s, late 19th century, there were 2 time crypts, which were safes that had a pile of photographs inside. And there's actually another historian who's doing really interesting work on 19th century time capsules, so I don't have to do that, which is great. But yeah, I'm doing 20th century time capsules. But I think probably I would like to see one dug up, and there's enough out there that I think that I can probably make that happen by putting a Google alert on my phone.
Where do people put these? If you wanted to do a time capsule, where would you put it? How does that work?
Everywhere. Lots of times under foundations, in walls of houses, under statues, if you have somewhere where you could put a statue,
And
in
then it's going to be just
cornerstones.
by chance that someone digs it up? That's what it's meant to be?
Oftentimes, yeah, I mean, some of them are by chance, some of them, I mean, there's another really interesting phenomenon where a lot of them are like, 100 years or 200 years, and people just forget about them. So there's always this sad story where they're like, we finally remembered our time capsule, and we dug it up, or we couldn't find it or something. There's this kind of nutty time capsule society that's run out of Oglethorpe University in Georgia, and it's these guys that have a spreadsheet allegedly of every time capsule in the United States. And some of the ones, and a lot of them are just lost, so they have documentation of it being buried, but not necessarily found.
So if you wanted to do one, you could contact them and let them know so they could document it.
But actually, interestingly, both the National Archives and the Library of Congress have best practices, and the Smithsonian too actually all have best practices for time capsules. So the time capsule is a sort of popular enough practice that all of these kind of public history institutions understand that you might want guidance in how to do it. So there's an entire literature of, what kind of box you can choose and, what sort of saran wrap you should put around your things.
Well, couldn't you argue the pyramids were the original?
Well, exactly.
Right? I mean, any of these crypts,